All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Kari Diener, the Executive Director of the Refugee Self Reliance Initiative, or the RSRI. The RSRI is a network of over 250 stakeholders and professionals who support refugee self-reliance through programming, advocacy, research, and policies. Together, we aim to respond to the urgency and scale of forced displacement today by cultivating a shared evidence base, developing technical tools and resources, and convening virtually and in person to strengthen collaboration and exchange. We are so excited to gather today for part one of our new Self-Reliance Dialogue series, co-hosted with the Women's Refugee Commission and the International Institute for Environment and Development. For our audience today, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and also to add questions to the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screens. Starting with today's session, this dialogue series aims to foster critical conversations around refugee self-reliance as an approach for people who are experiencing protracted displacement. We also hope to capture academic evaluations of self-reliance while centering the needs and perspectives of people with lived experience. I would like to introduce our host and moderator for today, Lucy Earle. Lucy is the director of the Human Settlements Group at the International Institute for Environment and Development, where she also leads the Institute's research and policy engagement on urban cities, urban crises, and forced displacement. She has recently co-edited a special edition of the journal Environment and Urbanization on the topic of forced displacement and the city. Lucy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kari, and it's wonderful to be here and with our speakers and panelists. So to explain why we're here, why IIED is in the chair today for this first of a new series of dialogues. So for the past 4 years, ending actually in April this year, IIED was leading a research program with refugees and IDPs in 4 countries, in Afghanistan, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Jordan. And this was a comparative piece of work looking at the well-being and livelihoods of displaced people, and the comparison was between camps and urban areas. So I'm going to share my screen now, so you can just see a slide where we have got the name of the project. Hopefully that will go into presentation mode there, and you should be able to see the partners on the right-hand side of the screen. So it was a big project across these 4 countries, the range of partners from academia, from civil society, and from also displaced people's organizations. And at the start of this project, I confess, when we were writing the proposal, we thought to ourselves, we really must say something in this proposal about self-reliance, because it was 2018, 2019, and we just had the Global Compact on Refugees approved by member states, and it was very much a topic of discussion at the time. But as the research unfolded, we never became entirely convinced of what was meant by self-reliance and whether we were seeing self-reliance in urban areas. We were working with populations that were assumed to be self-reliant, in that most of them were not receiving any assistance, but that didn't seem quite good enough to us as a description. And instead, what we ended up doing was exploring more in depth, like holistic ideas of well-being, which I know is something that the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative has also looked at, and looking at enterprises, so beyond livelihoods, also looking at enterprises of refugees. And this project brought out a lot of articles, blogs, podcasts, policy briefs, working papers. We have a website there where you can see protracteddisplacement.org, where you'll be able to find a lot of resources, and also some more information about IIED's work on forced displacement and the second link you see there. And the question of self-reliance, well, we did talk about it a bit in the end. So the 4th paper, the paper on the far right, you can see there about the myths about protracted displacement, does engage on the topic a bit. But what we ended up doing is giving space to two of our panelists here today to write about self-reliance in the special issue of IIED's journal, which is Environment and Urbanization. So we've just brought out this special issue, and in it you'll see there are most of the papers are free to download. It's a journal that's focused on practitioners as well as academics. As much as possible, it gives voice to authors from majority world countries and women. It has an enormous number of downloads. It's an extremely successful journal, and it's used a lot in teaching. And I think if you go to the link at the bottom of the page there and look at some of the papers, you'll see why. There's some really fantastic papers, really grounded in very relevant issues to our discussions today. So one of those papers, as I mentioned, is by Boel, McAteer and Kellie Leeson, and I'm going to stop sharing now, if I can manage that, and tell you a bit about Kellie Boel. So first of all, I think we're going to start off with Boel. Boel McAteer is a researcher in the Human Settlements Group at IIED, so she's a colleague of mine, where she works on urban forced displacement, looking particularly in Nairobi and Uganda. And she's recently completed a project looking at refugee penalties, so examining the fees and bribes paid by refugees to keep their businesses running in Nairobi. And Boel has a PhD from the University of Edinburgh on refugee self-reliance in Turkey, so very well qualified to speak on this issue. And our other main speaker in this dialogue is Kellie Leeson, who is currently the Deputy Vice President of New Initiatives at the Women's Refugee Commission. She has 20 years of experience leading large-scale humanitarian programs for displaced populations in Africa, Latin America, and Europe. She's held leadership roles with the International Rescue Committee and the NYU's Development Research Institute, and she co-founded the Refugee Self Reliance Initiative, so she'll be familiar to many of you. So we were lucky enough to count on Kellie's support throughout the Protracted Displacement Project, giving her expertise on issues around self-reliance and on gender, which was amazing. And Boel was a dedicated member of the research team, has also produced quite a few of the publications I mentioned before. So I'm going to hand over to them now to talk about these, the discussion that they've had on paper and in person around self-reliance. And when they've finished, I will introduce you to our discussants, Mohamed, Laura, and Salim, who are online, who you can see on the screen. I'll introduce them more fully when we open the floor to their reflections. But for now, it's over to Boel and then Kellie.
Thank you so much. And it's great to see so many people here. So I'm going to kick us off and tell you a little bit about how this particular dialogue piece that we're going to talk about today came about. So it was within the context, as Lucy said, of this protracted displacement project that both Kellie and I worked on. And very much like Lucy said, in the realm of we really must say something about self-reliance. So we all met up with partners on the project to discuss the articles we were going to write for the special issue that has just come out. And Kellie and I, with others, ended up in a bit of a discussion on how to frame a potential article on self-reliance. So do we take a critical stance, as many academics do, or do we take a more pragmatic stance? And we didn't really come to an agreement on that for the purpose of an article. So in the end, we said, you know what, let's just do both. Let's try to write something that has both perspectives. And because ENU has this dialogue format, that's what we ended up doing. So I'm going to talk through my sort of entry points to the subject a little bit before handing over to Kellie. So as Lucy said, my background with this topic, refugee self-reliance, is through my PhD, which was focused on gender and self-reliance in the context of Syrian refugees in Turkey. And this was just past 2015 and all the things that happened in Europe then. So it was at the time of the EU-Turkey agreement. So there was a big shift in programming, very much from the sort of humanitarian lens at the start of the Syrian crisis or the first few years, coming to a more sort of, okay, now people are staying here, so we're going to have to think differently in terms of how we program. So self-reliance was a big buzzword at the time. And I think as a concept, it's sort of intuitively easy to agree with. It's something that everybody sort of understands, this sort of teach a man to fish idea. But there seemed to be a huge gap between the idea of self-reliance that everybody agrees on and what it actually means in practice. And this is especially true for women. So I had a bit of a gender focus in my research there. So that definitely came up. But starting with the concept itself, there are many critics who came before me. So there's lots to read there in the literature. But probably one of the most prominent academic critiques of the concept is that it's so neoliberal. So we're going to start there today. Basically, it places an individual burden, this idea of self-reliance, it places a burden on refugees themselves to be good market actors and essentially sort their own lives out as entrepreneurs, which is really a lot to ask of any population. Not everybody can be an entrepreneur, right? Let alone if you're in displacement and you have all these other issues. And because of how self-reliance is measured, often very questionably as a lack of aid dependency, it has been known to also cause aid withdrawal. So if you stop giving a population aid and you sort of walk away and you think, oh, they must be self-reliant because they're not receiving anything, that's unfortunately often how it works. And then on the other side of that, which is what I looked at in my research, where support is provided, it's very often unsustainable. And that's especially true in camp settings, where livelihood support has very little promise of actual financial independence. But it happens in cities as well. So then in Turkey, many of you I'm sure know, it's like 97% urban displacement or something like that. It's like very few people in camps. And it's the same problems there. So livelihood support can be very often is vocational training. So you go to a training program that may or may not lead to an actual job, most often not. It can be cash for work, where you're given some cash to do something, so you earn a little money for a while. But of course, as soon as the cash runs out, the program's gone. Or you produce something to sell. And this was especially common for women in my research in Turkey. It was very often things like knitting or jewelry making, or something. You would produce something that you're then meant to sell. And unfortunately, it was very often things that didn't have any real business prospects. So if it takes you like half a day to make a pair of earrings, like how many do you have to make to, there's no way to actually earn a living from that. So that's my introduction. So over to Kellie for yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Boel. And thank you everyone for being here today for this important conversation in our field. I know many of us on this call are thinking about this issue and grappling with this issue. And Boel, thank you so much for the background of how we came to this paper with lots of back and forth in our discussions, but then actually just turning that into the paper. And also for highlighting some of the concerns around self-reliance that I think we'll get into in more depth here in this discussion. So just to set the context a little bit, I mean, as many of you on this call, I'm sure you know that the concept of self-reliance is not new. It has been around for a long time. And our colleague Evan Easton Calabria, who may be on this call today, has written extensively on this topic. And I really encourage you to look at some of her writing on this topic. And as many of you probably know, there are 3 prescribed durable solutions for refugees. There's return, resettlement, and integration. We also know that there are a limited percentage of refugees who actually have access to any of those 3 durable solutions. We know as well that there's longer term displacement over the last number of years, with more and more refugees in displacement for 5, 10, 20, 30 years. We can just look at the Syria conflict to look at the refugees in Jordan and Turkey. Many of them have been refugees for over 10 years. The refugees from the Congo, Somalia, who have been refugees for 10, 20, 30 years, from one generation to the next. We also know that more and more, as Boel mentioned, more and more refugees are in cities with their own networks, their own ecosystems, their own systems. Also, when we think about refugee situations, they're often lumped into this humanitarian space. And when we think about long-term displacement, they're not an emergency. They don't get the attention an emergency gets. They don't get the resources emergency get. And when we think about that, then all of a sudden we have all of these people who are just kind of left. And so when we think about the system, this is what had led us to really focusing on self-reliance, is that many refugees were left with few options. It's not as if refugees themselves are languishing, but the system is languishing in its support for refugees. And the idea around self-reliance, the idea around the Self Reliance Initiative was really intended to address this gap We cannot put our head in the sands and just say, you know, we want refugees to be able to be integrated when we know they actually were not being integrated. So what is some alternative to at least provide support in this time when the durable solutions are not being met, to really help refugees to rebuild their lives and really look at long-term solutions. So that really is the idea around self-reliance in this initiative is, you know, it is the best alternative when the durable solutions were really not available. I also just want to address the issue of the camp settings, because I know that there is talk around self-reliance in camps, and the Self-Reliance Initiative itself, given that I'm co-founder, I know these are the conversations that we have. It really came from the urbanization that was top of mind in 2011, 2012, that really looking at self-reliance in the urban setting. That said, we know a lot of the partners in this work do work in camp settings as well. So many of them have been using the Self-Reliance Index, for instance, in the camp settings. And this has provided a tremendous opportunity to learn about how self-reliance actually looks in camps and how the index itself responds in camps. And we really are finding it's not the most ideal tool for a camp setting. In the SRI 3.0, please check it out, has just been released. And it tries to address some of those concerns in the camp setting, where and specifically in how the scoring is being addressed. So the Self-Reliance Index is a holistic tool, and there is a score related to that. But now there is an additional tool, additional score rather, that is looking at just meeting basic needs. And being able to meet basic needs is really an important milestone to meet. But that is not exactly self-reliance. And so now there are two scores that are in this SRI 3.0 to address some of these concerns around self-reliance and where self-reliance really can be achieved. So that is, you know, to address some of those issues around the camp setting. So back over to you, Boel.
Thanks, Kelly. Yes, as you'll realize, there are many things we actually agree on as well. But to come back to this, even if we overlook the sort of the cash for work, there's sort of obviously unsustainable bits of self-reliance that are out there. Even if we overlook that, I wonder what it is that we're actually trying to achieve. Because even where the support is well planned and actually fits with the labor market, which is rare because it's really, really hard to do, there's a narrow focus on income generation and labor market integration that I see as quite problematic in itself, because it overlooks all the other things that refugees lack, that for other people support their working lives. So that includes, of course, healthcare, education, documentation, all of these things that sort of add up to a healthy working life. And there's a question about who benefits, because self-reliance is so often sold as a win-win for host societies. You know, it's great for refugees to get jobs and support themselves, but it's also great for the host nation because you sort of get a population to fill your labor market gaps with, essentially. But unfortunately, when there's a gap in the labor market, it's usually there for a reason. It's usually there because nobody else wants to be there, because of the terrible conditions that so often are around, and is so often where refugees end up. So there's a sort of inherent risk that including refugees in the labor market and calling that self-reliance means including them in the worst possible bits of the labor market on the worst possible terms.
Great, so I'll jump in here. Looking at self-reliance just as an economic response is limiting and is limited. And with the Self-Reliance Initiative itself, one of the areas that we've talked about a lot and is reflected in the way that a lot of the work has been designed is that it is not just around finding a job. It is with a more holistic view. And, you know, admittedly, I think that there's a lot of times that it kind of falls back into just this economic piece, but a lot of it is looking more holistically. What are the real barriers for refugees to get on their feet? And we hear over and over again, it's often healthcare. Healthcare is a huge challenge that many refugees face to get on their feet. I mean, to keep their family healthy first and foremost, but then to also be able to get back on their feet. So it is looking at a holistic approach to self-reliance, which includes, meeting the basic needs. We did a paper that is looking at the how this has been understood. And so please, maybe we can put that in the link as well, with, the basic needs really at the center. It's a conceptual framework with really the basic needs at the center, but then really looking at the kind of the concentric circles out, how people can actually meet their longer term goals of having some stability longer term, and also, in the medium term, but then also in the long term. So looking at beyond just income, also looking at housing, looking at the rental situation, education and access to education, healthcare, and safety, and also their social networks as well. So really looking at it in a more holistic viewpoint. And really the Self-Reliance Initiative was created in part to address this limited view that is just around livelihood access. And we know that self-reliance, this idea of self-reliance, can be weaponized to push people off of aid or just to be focused on the livelihoods piece. But we do hope that the Self-Reliance Initiative itself really provides a space like this dialogue to have these conversations, to look more widely at what it is that we mean by self-reliance and what people actually need to be self-reliant. Because if you do look at just the jobs piece, we can see that people are just pushed into the worst jobs, just pushed into exploitive situations. But if we widen that conversation and really look at what people need to be self-reliant and have those conversations at the highest levels, then that changes the conversation.
So I think this holistic view of self-reliance is actually really, really helpful. That's exactly what we need. And I think we also agree that it's an interim solution, that it's not the permanent, end goal for refugees, but it's what we're doing in the meantime while we're waiting for something else. But my problem with that is that it's very often not treated as an interim solution by states and by governments. It's very much sold as the solution that's going to stay as it is forever, which is, I think, not to the benefit of any refugees. And on a sort of conceptual level, I really wonder why we need to call it self-reliance for refugees when it's not called that for anybody else. Because if we do take all of these other sectors into consideration, which we have to, then it's really about integration. It's really about having access to support systems that everybody else in society has access to. And we know that states are in control, and governments very often decide that we don't want refugees to work, we don't want refugees to have access to this and that, but we want them to be self-reliant. That's the sort of end to it. And that's the part that I find unrealistic and honestly misleading about the word self-reliance, because there's so much emphasis on the self. You're supposed to rely only on yourself. And if we're honest, nobody else in the world lives that way. Am I self-reliant if I'm relying only on myself? No, of course not. Nobody else is. So why are we expecting people in very, very difficult situations to be? That's it for me. Over to Kellie for a final word.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we think a lot about is that we can't look at this as a binary, that it is, indefinite support for refugees or it is a durable solution. And really looking at this as a journey. And I hear you when you say, share your concern that it is often looked at as the final point. But that can't be the case, because we really cannot let states off the hook. We really do need to see how self-reliance is a piece of that journey towards a durable solution for refugees. But I guess the point that we've made with the Refugee Self Reliance Initiative is that if you wait for that, then you're doing a disservice to refugees by not providing the support that they need along the way towards that durable solution. So we need to make sure that we're not just letting this linger. We have to make sure that we're doing both things at the same time, helping refugees to achieve self-reliance, start being able to plan for their longer term, while at the same time that we, join together to advocate for refugee rights. So back over to you, Lucy.
Thank you so much, Kellie, Boel. I really want to jump in and tell you what I think, but that's not my job. So I'm going to hold back and introduce our three panelists who are going to tell us what they think. And they are much better placed to do that than I am. So first of all, we have Mohamed Hassan, who's researcher at the Refugee-led Research Hub based in Nairobi. Mohamed is a Somali refugee with over 2 decades of lived experience in Kakuma refugee camp. He's a prominent advocate for refugee rights and inclusion, a graduate of Princeton University's Global History Lab, and has done research on refugee leadership, oral history, and self-reliance. And through his work, Mohamed champions refugee leadership in research, policy, and practice, and contributes to shaping policies that enhance the lives of displaced communities. We also will be hearing from Laura Valencia, who is originally from Colombia, but now living in Ecuador, and has experienced displacement at an early age. At the moment, she's a communications coordinator and strategy support person at the Global Refugee Youth Network. So among her most notable achievements are her active participation in the Global Refugee Youth Consultations held in Ecuador and Geneva, where she contributed valuable insights as a founding member of the Global Youth Advisory Council, and her active participation in several high-level events, where she always seeks to bring the opinion of refugee youth to the table. And she uses her ongoing studies in marketing and digital content to connect with refugee youth and stakeholders through social media. And finally, we'll also be hearing from Salim Najjar, who's co-founder of Umbrella 500. So Salim is an entrepreneur and expert in digital transformation and e-commerce. He's recognized globally for his work in empowering small businesses and entrepreneurs. As the co-founder of Umbrella 500, he has supported over 13,000 entrepreneurs through tailored programs designed to foster innovation and growth. Throughout his career, Salim has collaborated with organizations like the World Bank, the EU, and Mercy Corps, designing impactful entrepreneurship and digital support programs. So I'm going to turn first to Mohamed for his reflections and any questions he might have for our panelists. And in the meantime, please do put your questions, the rest of you out there, put your questions in the Q&A for the panelists or for the RSRI or for our discussants who are about to speak now. So over to you, Mohamed. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for that introduction. And I want to thank Kellie and Boel for that dialogue and the discussion piece. Wow, it's such a heavy topic, such a heavy discussion. Where do we come in? I want to use my time to highlight 3 points. And that came out in the discussion, in the debate. So one, I think there is a framing and there's a disconnect. And I think that framing and disconnect is because of oftentimes self-reliance is seen as in isolation by itself, but we have to tie it to other key pillars from the outset. I think the framing that self-reliance itself as a durable solution, it's a very flawed, premise. That this cannot be the end all. However, does that mean that there is no need for self-reliance? Self-reliance, I would go so far as to say it's human nature. There's one thing that self-reliance means to displaced people, and then there's another thing it means to program officers and NGOs. For a displaced person, for a refugee in the context of Kenya, what does self-reliance mean to them? And I think it is the difference between, sleeping in a tent exposed to the sun and the elements and the scorpions and all of that, and the ability to have dignified shelter, dignified living. It's the difference between being able to send your kids to school. It's the difference between going hungry because you have to wait for the next cycle of food rations, or being able to go outside and buy food for your family. And I think for people on the ground experiencing displacement, self-reliance is about mobility. It's about choice. It's about access. But then how do NGOs or states, how do they see self-reliance? And I think oftentimes self-reliance has become endless capacity building programs, financial literacy programs, business trainings. It's been conceptualized very narrowly as self-employment, micro-entrepreneurship. Everyone becomes the next, app developer, and etc. And that's not really what's happening. And I think that's where we see the biggest, that disconnect. But what is the root of that disconnect? I think for me, self-reliance very closely ties in with broader discussions around systemic issues, meaningful inclusion, meaningful participation, power dynamics in these spaces. Who is actually defining these concepts? Who is designing these programs? And what we try to do here at the Refugee-led Research Hub in Nairobi, but also in our offices in Kakuma, is we ask ourselves, how can we get refugees to be in that design phase, whether it's the design of research studies and knowledge production, or whether it's the design of livelihood programs themselves. I think here in Kenya, especially for the past 30 years, 40 years since the advent of, the arrival of Somali refugees in the early 1990s, the Lost Boys from South Sudan, there is this entrenched aid system that has one way of operating, one way of doing things, that has that line of the experts who are non-refugees, and then the beneficiaries who are the refugees themselves. And that now leads us to just, trying to define things and move and make progress. So for us here at the Refugee-led Research Hub, how do we include refugees in meaningful opportunities that are beyond self-employment and micro-entrepreneurship? For us here on the ground, it's an ethical issue, it's a moral issue, and it's a relevancy issue. How can, livelihood programs, how can self-reliance initiatives that are funded by donors to the tune of millions, how can you say that, you support refugee self-reliance, and the only support you do is providing $300 to small businesses? You're not willing to contribute. You're not willing to have refugees be in positions of leadership in your organization. There's a systematic perception of what a refugee is and what they can do. And that leads us to what we see as program failures on the ground. How can we push on those boundaries? And one thing that I always hear when I ask professionals and when I ask decision makers, how long, what will it take for us to diversify the workforce? How long will it take for us to meaningfully include refugees in our own organizations? What I often hear is the default answer: restrictive policies. The policy will not allow us to do that. But again, as researchers, let's look at the evidence here in Kenya, in Uganda, in East Africa. There's a relatively open policy about refugees' right to work. There's a relatively open labor laws around refugee participation. But there's a status quo that refugees can only work as incentive workers with organizations. Organizations have become used to that, complacent in those kind of status quos. And anything that is outside the norm that tries to challenge these structures, oftentimes you don't get the support, you don't get the funding that is needed to make change. One last thing I want to leave with you is, in my own story and so many other refugees here in Kenya who've been able to make that progress from the camps to Nairobi, for example, to urban areas. Countless people that I know, if I step outside right now, they have no self-reliance at all. The notion of what they want to do in Nairobi, in the city, it's to the extent that the system itself will not allow them to be self-reliant, that they have to be vulnerable for them to access services and benefits. Otherwise, it's very binary, the discussions around self-reliance. Either you're 100% successful, or you're a single mother with 7 kids who's absolutely, vulnerable to the extreme. And I think there are nuances in those discussions. And I think the last call to action I want to make for all of us is, how can we be more inclusive in our own program designs? How can we say that, how can we have refugees as colleagues, sitting with us in our offices and helping us to think about some of these issues so that we can have meaningful and lasting change? Here in Kenya, with the Sharika plan, with the Refugee Act, there is that, self-reliance is at the forefront of everyone's mind. But I don't think self-reliance as a durable solution, again, as I said in the beginning, without access to pathways to citizenship, without pathways to ownership, these other structural everyday things, you don't have that. Being a shopkeeper, or even being a professional, or being a staff of an organization will not allow you to escape the experience of being displaced, to escape. And that falls within that fallacy of the exceptionalism, that somehow if you're an exceptional refugee, if you're a very smart refugee, if you're a competent refugee, that somehow you can transcend your lived experience and you can transcend all of that and you can be this. That's not what is actually That's not the reality of most people's lives. So yeah, there is truth to both kind of discussions. And I think well-being, I think a huge component of well-being is financial security. If I can send my children to school, how is my well-being? If I can feed my family, how's my well-being? So financial component, while it's not everything, it is a huge aspect of well-being. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mohamed. That was really insightful and great to hear more about the Refugee-Led Research Hub and the work that you're trying to do. Turn now to a very different context, to Laura in South America, to hear from her on her reflections on self-reliance.
Thank you so much, Lucy, and thank you so much, Boel and Kellie, and thank you for this space also. As a former refugee in Ecuador, and also working with a lot of refugees around different contexts and hearing about the different problems that they face, we need to reflect on how we understand this journey. And we have been hearing this a couple of times during this discussion. Self-reliant, it's not the final destination. And we sometimes think this is the place that refugees should eventually reach. But when we look more deeply, we see it's not just the end goal. Self-reliance is a process, a journey that moves at its own space, shaped by individuals' experience, aspirations, and the environment in which refugees find themselves. This journey is more complex than simply achieve economic independence or meeting basic needs. Through self-reliance, it's about building a dignified life, a life that offers opportunities, respect, and above all, hope. But for many refugees, this path is true, but with barriers, structural, social, and systematic. These are real and tangible obstacles. We see refugees who, despite having the skills and drive to contribute to their new communities, are held back because the lack of something as fundamental like work permits or unidentified documents. We teach the people to fish, but what happens if they cannot reach the river? Self-reliance for refugee means having access to fundamental rights, the right to work, move freely, receive an education, and access to healthcare. These are some of the foundations of which self-reliance is built. Without this, any effort we can make towards supporting their independence is incomplete. For this reason, we must continue advocating for these policies that recognize these rights for refugees, and as we will for any young person trying to build a future. Perhaps the most profound realization is that refugees are not passive recipients in this process. They are drivers to change and the potential to lead and inspire and create solutions for challenges they face. Their resilience, creativity, dreams can make the greatest strength. It's not enough for us to simplify what alongside them. We must create the conditions for them to flourish. I want to share some examples of people that work in and have been part of the network. One is based in Uganda. This organization is called Similar Ground and implement a beekeeping and liquid soap making project for women and girls, creating sustainable livelihood opportunities within just 3 months. The results have been really inspiring, but for this project to become a pathway to be self-reliant, it needs long-term funding to ensure continuity and growth. And another remarkable effort comes from Alpha Touchbirds in Malawi, a youth-led organization empowering youth refugees with IT skills, such as computer basics, web designs, and software creation, by offering both online and on-site job opportunities. They are giving youth, especially young women, the chance to build skills and careers that can lead to financial independence. But at the same time, they need long-term funding to ensure the continuity. The journey to self-reliance look different in urban areas and refugee camps, as Kellie mentioned. In urban spaces, young refugees find jobs opportunities and access to services, but the challenge, like living high costly life, legal restrictions, and ever-present shadow of xenophobia makes this an obstacle to become self-reliance. So it's important to reflect on these complexities and feel deep sense of responsibility to continue paving the way to refugee youth to thrive and not just survive. So I want to finalize just reminding ourselves it's not just about reaching or fixing a point on a map. It's a journey, a process of growth, and not one that we must walk together with an open heart and with a commitment to create a future where young and people, that is refugees, can dream and build and create a better tomorrow for themselves and for their communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. And it's great to hear those examples of refugee entrepreneurship, which because it's a perfect segue to Salim for his final thoughts on his particular take on self-reliance. Thank you, Salim.
Sure, thank you, Lucy. Thanks, and thanks, Kellie and Boel, for the great insights and ideas. This is super important to me. And as a Syrian entrepreneur myself, fled Syria in 2012. I was one of the people who received support from and benefits from those organizations who design this program. Also, then after a while, I joined programs and I joined organizations like World Bank to design programs to support refugees and refugees entrepreneurs. So I was on both sides of this, and that's why I see this as a super important topic, and we need to give more insights and more awareness to the donors, to the organization who designed those programs. Because while we're talking now, the problem is still growing up. So while we're talking, people in Lebanon and in the other areas are losing their shelters and their homes. So this is a super important topic, and because also the funding will end, or the funding will not be the same as usual. So helping designing long-term sustainable programs. I'm in Den Haag, and only yesterday we were talking to organization and about building sustainable program. We were designing initiatives and we're implementing them, but those initiatives are going to end because this is how the donor designed this. So I guess we need like also to come up with a way to communicate those ideas with the original donor who designed this program to be ending at specific time. So for 1 year, program for 1 year, 2 year max. So how we can add this as a KPI to the program? Like we come up, maybe the program end in 1 year, but we come to the beneficiary in 1, 2, 3 years to see how it affected their life. Are they self-reliance now? So I can emphasize more about this, and I would like to hear like if we can come up with a way to communicate all of us with this idea, and like Kellie and Boel spoke a lot about the cost of not doing any refugee reliance, and this is very good. And I guess we need to give more shadows about this and share more stories, and maybe we can design programs that don't focus on quantities. Like most programs come to this area and trying to help 1,000 refugees, but maybe some of the other programs trying to help like 10, 100 refugees to be self-reliance and to help them work by themselves or establish a small company or a small business and everything else. So I don't want to make a long, maybe I come up with more questions, and especially that those are very insightful on countries like Ethiopia, Jordan, and Kenya. Maybe we need to look more about more countries who are getting the best successful lessons from those countries to share it with any other countries who are suffering from the refugee, and trying like to shift the mindsets who are doing the policies and everything, like to help them like do a small achievement to help this more justice for refugees around the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Salim. And I agree there's probably much more that needs to be done on the policy side of things. And I'm just going to get in a quick reflection. I feel that a lot of people out on this webinar speaking are thinking a lot about self-reliance and what that means in urban contexts. I'm not sure we see quite so much engagement on that issue from multilateral donors, from the UN, from financial institutions, but there's still a lot, in some countries, a lot of focus on camps that seem to close off the bandwidth to think about what this might mean in urban areas. There are some examples that are better. There's some movement in Nairobi right now, which is quite exciting, but I feel that we are doing a lot of thinking, but this journey, the idea of self-reliance is a journey. I think there's a lot more advocacy that needs to be done around that with the people that make it happen. So I'm going to turn back to Boel and Kellie just to reflect on what they've heard, and just drawing in a couple of questions from the chat, some of which are really quite difficult and perhaps go beyond our level of expertise. There are questions about, for example, with 90% of the world's refugees in highly vulnerable countries, why don't these nations start addressing refugees' needs alongside their citizens? That's a complicated one. Another one about how we can achieve free movement and access to opportunities as a durable solution for refugees. Again, possibly slightly above Boel and Kellie's pay grade, that one. And then an interesting one that's come in just now, you might want to think about. Question, why are we linking sustainable support for augmented wellbeing to donor programs whose funding is dwindling? Isn't it more important to design better ways to engage the private sector with blended finance instruments? So, well, Kellie, you can take any, all, or none of those and just reflect on what you've heard, just a few minutes each. And then I'll also ask if our other panelists want to come in and make any additional comments before we close. Boel, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm going to start with reflections and come back to the very difficult questions. I think there's so much common ground here. We presented this as a battle, but I really don't think it is. I also picked up on this self-reliance as a process and a journey, and not as a destination. I think is something we should really hang on to and try to work on after this. Laura and Mohamed both mentioned the sort of human side. You said it's about hope and about a dignified life and about human nature, and that comes up so often, you know, what refugees want themselves. I think this is in Kellie's bit of the article, actually, but people saying that, you know, I just want to feel like a human, and that's what it's about. So that's, of course, a very important side. I think this discrepancy that you mentioned as well, Salim, between that, what does it mean to the people on the ground versus what does it mean in programming, and perhaps touching on the difficult question, what does it mean to host societies versus donors? What does it mean to the funders versus the states who are having a difficult time with their own populations as well? Kellie, over to you.
Great. And thank you so much for all of the reflections and the questions. And again, coming back to this journey piece. And, you know, I also want to highlight that even achieving basic self-reliance is difficult in a lot of these situations. Laura, you mentioned, I really like that idea of, you know, teach a person to fish, but then don't let them go to the river, I think is really an important concept there. So even achieving self-reliance is really difficult. So if we can help people move towards self-reliance, meeting their needs, that is a step in the right direction. We hope with the Refugee Self Reliance Initiative and with the index itself, we've never said it was perfect. We never said it was the end all, but it has moved the conversation. It has helped the conversation. We are supporting a lot of our partners, really thinking about what Mohamed said. A lot of our partners, when they use the Self-Reliance Index, I think it does expose what those barriers are. And we hear over and over again from refugees, the access to documentation being such a critical barrier for so many people. So using the Self-Reliance Index can help expose what their limitations are, what their barriers are, and also to explore different opportunities for really helping people to achieve self-reliance beyond the livelihoods piece. We know some partners are looking at using a housing first sort of model. We know some are really looking at it in conjunction with mental health and GBV. So there's a lot of different ways that people can approach this. And we think through this, using this Refugee Self Reliance Initiative, which is a convening space, using this index can help us to better understand what can help people to achieve their own goals, but also to expose all of the policy needs to help change these conversations and to expose some of these barriers. And just briefly to mention the funding, also this, I think, helps bring more people into the conversation. This convening space also moves it out of just being within the humanitarian space to look at what other funding possibilities, the private sectors, the multilaterals, but also we know a lot of remittances are tied into this conversation as well, and how to make sure that we're looking at all of these issues as holistically as possible. Back over to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Kellie. So can I open up to our panelists for their sort of final couple of minutes each to reflect on what you've heard or make any additional points? Mohamed has his hand up, so Mohamed, you may go first, of course.
Yeah, no, I think I just wanted to make that point. I think listening and reading the chat also, I think avoiding the false binaries. I think honestly, myself being in this space, growing up in this space, living in it, working in that space now, I see it happens a lot, these binaries. So one, it's either self-reliance is the end all, be all, it's a durable solution, it's 100%, it's the only thing that matters. And then the other side of that, which is self-reliance is not a concept, it shouldn't exist, it doesn't make sense, it's bad, let's just throw away with it. And I think trying to find a nuanced approach to that, there is so much value in this idea of self-reliance, because honestly, for me, the alternative to self-reliance, it's humiliation, it's indignity, it is dehumanization. And you really see that, by the long lines at service providers' offices, how people have to lower themselves, put their head down just so that they can get a piece of service. So for me, that framing, it's that nuance, it's needed. It is something that is, a part of being human, but then at the same time, recognizing the limitations that come with it. I'm self-reliant, I have a job, but I don't have a durable solution. My children don't have a durable solution. They don't have the pathways that they need to live a normal life. So having that, it's not one or the other. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Laura, would you like to come in?
Yeah, so I think it's important also to recognize that for refugees, even in the same country, achieving self-reliance will look different. So it's important just to understand, hearing the needs and what they want to achieve, especially when we try to find durable solutions for them. So of course, we have been just listening about documentation, freely moving, access to jobs. But these are the general issues and challenges that refugees face. But also when we look more deeply in the different contexts, different countries, different situations, we're going to find that the durable solutions to get the self-reliance look different. So it's important that we don't have just one similar approach for all refugees. We need to adapt to the situation, to the needs, and to the challenges that they face. And it's important when we have these programs to have that in mind, to be really, or find the successful in the programs that we want to create for them to achieve this goal.
Thank you, Laura. And Salim, you've got a couple of minutes.
Of course.
Last word.
Yeah, sure. So maybe I can share a little story with the World Bank. We designed a program back then in 2018 until 2021. And it was targeting 1,500 small businesses led by refugees. And one of the most, we were trying to support those refugees, like to establish those businesses. And we ended up like most of them couldn't register their businesses. It wasn't easy. So 90% of that supported ones managed to do some small businesses from their homes. So they are trying to be resilient. And we ended up increasing their sales because of small digital marketing help, small e-commerce help, small help. We ended up helping them to start selling, and on average, their increasing of sales was 30% during less than a year. So imagine if we focus all of us like to help refugees to help themselves, like, and we keep this in mind. They want to be part of the solution. So this how we can help them. And self-reliance should be one of the indicator of any program that is designed to help refugees. So that's it from my side.
Thanks, Salim. And I think we can agree that the concept probably isn't going anywhere. The best that we can do, I think, or what we ought to be doing, is engaging with it, but making sure that people understand the depths of the depths of the concept and what it really means. So the holistic view that we've talked about. I mean, there are questions in the chat like, can we just get rid of this term? I think we're probably not able to do that, but if we really sort of get people to think about what it actually takes for refugees to be self-reliant, then we might be able to carry on having a productive conversation around the term. Kellie, Boel, any last minute thoughts?
I just want to say thank you for the conversation, Salim, Lara, and Mohamed, for your reflections, because Boel and I are just writing this as two non-displaced people. And so it's really important that we're continuing to have these conversations to hear what is the lived experience? What does this really mean to people who are living this? So thank you so much for sharing your reflections and making this such a fruitful conversation, and just also encourage everybody to read our paper and all the papers in this latest journal.
Yes, please do. They are free to access. We've paid lots of money so you can access them free. So please do read them. And finally, Boel.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's actually my main takeaway as well. What does it mean to refugees? That's the question we need to keep asking ourselves. And what does it mean in different contexts and in different places and to different people and to locals living in the same places? So hopefully we'll continue this work and continue this discussion. But thank you so much for today.
Thank you from me as well to all our panelists for their wonderful insights. And a quick last word to Kari, who's going to close for us.
Great. Thank you again, Lucy, for moderating, Kellie, Boel, for your insights and excellent paper, and to Mohamed, Salim, and Laura for your really insightful comments and reflections. This is just part one of a dialogue series that the RSRI will be convening over the upcoming period. You can see a link in the chat to join the COP mailing list, where we'll be sharing upcoming events, webinars, learning opportunities. We invite you to engage with our network and to become a part of the conversation and joint learning. And thank you again for joining today, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.